You see it everywhere, right? From late-night TV to big-time journalism, the interview is just a huge part of our world. On the surface, it seems so simple. One person asks questions, the other answers. But it turns out there's a massive, century-long debate raging just beneath the surface about whether it's a tool for truth or just a weapon. So, what's the real deal with the interview? Is it this noble art form, a genuine way to get to the truth? Or is it something way more sinister, an invasion of privacy, maybe even an assault on a person's very soul? That's the question we're digging into, and trust me, the two sides could not be more different. And we're not talking about small differences in opinion here. These views are at the total opposite ends of the spectrum. On one hand, you've got people calling it an art, a supremely serviceable medium that gives us these amazing, vivid impressions of people. And on the other, it's a crime, an assault that literally steals a person's soul. There is absolutely no middle ground here. All right, let's dive into that darker side first. It turns out some of the most famous creative people in history absolutely despised the interview, and they were not quiet about it. Take the Nobel Prize winner V.S. Naipaul. He talked about it with this really chilling sense of violation. For him, an interview wasn't just annoying. It was something that actually wounded people, making them lose a part of themselves. Just think about that for a second. And then you have Lewis Carroll, the guy who gave us Alice in Wonderland. He had what was called a just horror of the interviewer. He found the whole idea so disgusting that he refused every single request for an interview his entire life. He saw it as a total violation of his private world. But Rudyard Kipling, wow, he takes it to a completely different level. Just listen to the words he uses: immoral, a crime, an assault. He's not pulling any punches here. He's literally saying that a journalist asking him questions is the same as being physically attacked. That is an incredibly harsh condemnation. And then there's Saul Bellow, who came up with this really vivid, suffocating metaphor. He said interviews felt like thumbprints on his windpipe. You can almost feel that pressure, right? That feeling of being choked and pinned down by an endless barrage of questions. So you'd think the case is closed, right? The interview is just an immoral, wounding assault. End of story. But what if I told you there's a huge twist? What if some of its biggest critics were hiding a little secret? Okay, check this out. Rudyard Kipling, the same guy who called interviewing an assault, had actually gone and assaulted Mark Twain by interviewing him just a few years earlier. And H.G. Wells, who called it an ordeal, 40 years later, there he is, interviewing Joseph Stalin of all people. So the biggest haters were also doing it themselves. What is going on here? Well, this little paradox reveals something crucial. Even though these brilliant writers hated being the subject, they totally understood the interview's power. It's what you might call a supremely serviceable medium. It's a tool that's so incredibly effective, even its harshest critics couldn't help but use it. And look, this is why this whole thing really matters today. Think about it. How do you really get to know the famous people of our time? As Dennis Bryan says here, our most vivid, lasting impressions come from interviews. The person asking the questions holds a ton of power in shaping how we see the world. So to really get a grip on the interview's potential for good, we've got to look at a specific example. And for that, let's bring in the brilliant Italian novelist and scholar, Umberto Eco. He's basically the complete opposite of all those critics we just heard from. Right, so this is Umberto Eco. He was this amazing academic who, kind of against all odds, became this huge intellectual superstar. And for him, the interview wasn't some terrible assault to be afraid of. It was a stage. It was his way of sharing his really complex ideas with millions of people, way beyond the walls of a university. And this quote, it just perfectly sums up how he saw himself. He was a professor first, and then, on the weekends, he'd write these incredible novels. His books were just another way of exploring his academic work, and the interview became the perfect way for him to explain that deep connection to everyone. One of the biggest mysteries about Eco was just how on earth he was so productive. How did one guy do so much? Well, an interviewer actually asked him that exact question, and his answer, his secret, is just a total masterclass in how to think about time. He starts with this totally mind-bending question. He asks the interviewer, and by extension us, to imagine taking all the empty space out of the entire universe. What would you have left? It's such a brilliant way to hook you in. And boom, there's the punchline. All the matter in the known universe would shrink down to the size of his fist. He then takes this huge cosmic idea and connects it right back to our everyday lives, saying our lives are also filled with these kinds of empty spaces. And he even had a name for these little pockets of time: interstices. It's his term for all those little gaps in our day. Waiting for a bus, standing in a line, or, and this was his famous example, the time you spend waiting for an elevator. And his example just nails it. He joked that while he was waiting for a visitor to come up the elevator to his apartment, he had enough time to write a whole article. That little bit of waiting time, that's an interstice. He mastered turning those wasted moments into creative time. And this incredible life hack was shared with the whole world, all thanks to an interview. So as you can see, Eco's story just perfectly shows the other side of this whole debate. The interview isn't just a tool for prying into people's lives. It can be a vehicle for sharing pure genius and challenging the way we all think. And you have to remember, the book that made him a global star was, well, it was anything but an easy read. The Name of the Rose is this super dense detective story that's all about metaphysics, theology, and medieval history. It's a seriously challenging book. And yet, how many copies did it sell? We're talking 10 to 15 million copies. That kind of massive success just completely shattered what most publishers thought people wanted to read. And that success pointed to something really important, something Eco talked about in an interview. He said that publishers are basically wrong about us. They think people just want trash. But Eco proved that millions of readers are actually hungry for deep, difficult, and rewarding books. Which brings us right back to our big question, doesn't it? The interview can absolutely be an intrusion, a violation, or even feel like an assault. But, as someone like Umberto Eco shows us, it can also be the key that unlocks genius for the rest of the world. So the final question isn't really about whether the interview is good or bad. It's about whether we're willing to accept the risk of the assault for the chance to witness the art.